If we look at this phylogenetic tree of land plants, we can see that from the time these land plants developed from that ancestral green algae up until today, where we see all of this diversity around us, there were a number of different developments or things that had to evolve to help them to cope with the conditions of dry land. We've talked about the bryophytes, which was the liverworts, the hornworts, and the mosses. We talked about them having a dominant gametophyte. Then we talked about the transition to the vascular plants. And as we moved to the vascular plants, we had the diminishing of the gametophyte, and the sporophyte began to get a little more dominant. And now in this chapter, we're going to focus on what we call the seed plants. So the seed plants are vascular plants, but they're going to have this even better development, which is going to be the seeds. And this is going to give rise to two different groups, which we call the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about the evolution of seed plants. So what is a seed? Well, a seed is essentially, it's an embryo with a packaged food source or food supply right there with it. So this is an advantage because now, where in the last chapter we had that embryo which was dependent on the gametophyte, that kind of tied it down so that it had to stay with the gametophyte and it couldn't really travel very far. But as soon as we take that embryo and we package it up in a nice little capsule with the food supply, now we have the opportunity for that seed to travel great distances from the parent plant. So that's what we're going to see start to take place once we do have the seed plants evolve. Now, seeds originated approximately 360 million years ago, and most of the plants that we now know of today, they are seed plants. So when you go outside and you look at the typical plant outside, if you just picked one, you're probably going to be picking a seed plant. So if we talk about the seed plants and some of the other things that had to happen to get them to be so successful on land, we had reduced gametophytes. So that gametophyte that was once dominant in the bryophytes is going to get smaller and smaller. We're going to have more heterosporous plants. We're going to have the development of ovules. And then we're also going to have the evolution of pollen. These are all four important things that contributed to the success of plants on land. The first major advancement was the reduction of the gametophyte. So as we go from the bryophytes, which are considered to be our most primitive land plants, up to our seed plants today, we'll see that gametophyte get smaller and smaller. So here's an example of a bryophyte. So that's a non-vascular plant. It's very small, and in this case, the gametophyte generation was dominant. So when you look at a bryophyte, the green leafy part that you see is gametophyte tissue. The sporophyte is very small, and it's not going to be something that you're going to notice right away. The sporophyte is also dependent on the gametophyte. So this means that the gametophyte is going to provide nourishment for the sporophyte. So the sporophyte cannot live without being attached to the gametophyte. If we look at the beginnings of our vascular plants, this would be an example of a fern right here, or the pterophyta. In this case, at this point in time, we see the sporophyte now is going to be dominant. And we've got this tiny little gametophyte. And the gametophyte is much reduced. They're very small, actually hard to find when you're looking for them. And the sporophytes, they will grow out of the gametophytes, but then they're going to be self-sufficient once they've really developed and grown and gotten their start. So the sporophytes will be photosynthetic cells that can capture light energy and produce their own food. Once we move to the seed plants, which is what this chapter is based on, we're going to have microscopic gametophytes. So they will be microscopic male gametophytes, and they will be microscopic female gametophytes. So they're going to really be reduced from what we had before. So the trend is that the gametophyte got smaller and smaller, and the sporophyte got larger and larger. So they somewhat switched roles with each other. This was a very important development because now we can have gametophytes that are going to be able to depend on the sporophyte. And that's going to enable the gametophyte to really focus the energy on producing the gametes. It doesn't have to collect food and worry about producing food, but instead all energy can go into producing that egg and that sperm. Another big advancement for the seed plants is the more prevalent heterosporous condition. When we look at the seedless plants, the vast majority of them are homosporous. So that means that they produce one kind of spore, and then that spore germinates into both male and female gametophytes. If we're talking about heterospory, hetero means different. So in this case, we're getting two types of spores. One spore is going to produce the megasporangium. That will produce the megaspore. And the megaspore is going to grow into the female gametophyte. The flip side of that is that we're going to get microsporangia. That will produce microspores, and that will germinate into the male gametophyte. So we've got two types of spores. This is going to be by far the way that most seed plants are going to reproduce. They're going to have two different types of spores. The ovule and the production of eggs was another important advancement here. When we're talking about the ovule, one of the big things about the ovule, which was so beneficial, was that it has this integument tissue, which is sporophyte tissue, that is going to surround the megasporangium. So this integument sporophyte tissue is going to provide protection. So we've got this layer of protection that surrounds the megasporangium, and then that megasporangium can develop into the megaspore, and the megaspore is going to produce the egg. So we've got this egg that is very much protected here. The fourth major development was the production of pollen and sperm. The pollen grain is the male gametophyte, and the male gametophyte comes from the microspore. So the microspore is going to develop into the pollen grain, and then within the pollen grain, we can get the sperm produced. This pollen grain is going to be surrounded by sporopollenin. And this is going to really protect the surface of it. This means that that pollen grain is going to be good for travel. So it can go further distances. We're not going to have flagellated sperm like we had prior to this, but now we've got a pollen grain that's prepared to travel. So if we look at this picture, now we've got this little pollen grain down here at the bottom, and if that pollen grain and its protected coat can make its way to the ovule, then it can germinate, and we have the production of the sperm so that we can get our fertilization take place. And our fertilization is going to take place right there inside the ovule. So let's talk about the advantages of the seed. The seed was a really big development for plants, and we know that because most of the plants that we see today do in fact produce seeds. So if we look at the reasons why this is such a great thing for plants, first of all, they are multicellular. So if a seed is multicellular, it's going to be a little larger, and this is going to enable that little embryo inside to have protection, and it also is going to have food. So it's got kind of everything it needs right there in the seed. it's also going to be able to be dormant. So it can stay dormant for a long time in many cases. Sometimes seeds can be dormant for years. There are cases where they can be dormant for hundreds of years. And the reason that that's important is because if that seed is not in a place that is favorable for germination, then it can still remain alive, but it's not actually growing. So this seed stays dormant until the conditions are good for germination of the embryo. All of this together is going to enable separation, and we can say transport away from the parent plant. This is a big deal because this is going to really enable plants to spread out over the whole Earth's surface. So once we had the development of the seed, we really see this great expansion of the species of plants on dry land.